The end came when the clock chimed 3 in the morning of January 1547. Henry's heart, enlarged and weary from decades of excess, gave out as he slept. His breathing, which had become the stuff of nightmares, rattling like the death rattle of an ox, fell still. Among the items listed were 2 night stools, a pair of bellows, and a large red cushion for easing his aching legs, a stark counterpoint to the trappings of royalty. If you want to know more about how Henry's death set in motion the events that led to the English Reformation, check out my series, The 6 Wives of Henry VIII. Thanks for watching. After his death, these mundane objects became relics of a king brought low, each holding within its fibers a silent testament to his suffering. Outside the palace walls, Londoners scrambled for a glimpse of the late king's remains. They wanted to see the man who had dominated their lives for over 3 decades, both revered and feared. The crowds surged towards the Tower of London where Henry's coffin lay in state, their hushed whispers weaving tales of a king reduced to a shell of his former self, driven to despair by pain and his own demons. The stark reality of Henry's final years stood in stark contrast to the legend of the Renaissance prince. Once celebrated as a model of princely virtue, he was now remembered for his grotesqueries, the leaks from his ulcers and the opium-addled slurs that spilled from his lips. This wasn't the image his successors wanted to pass on. Edward Seymour, ambitious and ruthless, was eager to burnish his family's reputation after the scandals of the past decades. He pushed for a discreet burial, a sentiment echoed by the young king's mother. Queen Jane Seymour, whose own legitimacy had been secured only by Henry's last-minute declaration. However, Catherine Parr, now wed to the teenage King Edward, skillfully navigated the political minefield. She understood the power of spectacle and arranged for Henry's magnificent funeral. A last-minute flourish that belied her own deep grief, the grandeur served a dual purpose: assuaged the public's desire for closure and subtly burnished the new regime's legitimacy. As the funeral procession wound its way through London, the city's inhabitants saw not just the spectacle of a magnificent display of pageantry, but also a symbolic passing of the torch, a final act of magniloquence from a king who had loomed over their lives for so long. Around him, the court held its breath, each courtier's face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, their gazes fixed on the king's pallid visage. For Henry, there was no gentle release. Death arrived as it had visited all of his 58 years, a brutal assertion of power. He expired clutching the sheets, his fingernails digging deep into the linen, as if trying to anchor himself to life. When the first rays of dawn touched London, the trumpets sounded. A fanfare heralded a new era, one devoid of the terror that had permeated Whitehall for weeks. The king was dead. As news rippled through England, it ignited a powder keg of emotions. Relief washed over many, mingled with a morbid curiosity. The people had borne witness to Henry's colossal rise, and they knew his demise would unleash seismic changes. The quiet, unassuming figure of Edward VI took the throne, a child king guided by regents, while his counselors fought behind the scenes to mold the young monarch into their vision of an ideal ruler. But the transition was not as seamless as the court imagined. It was soon evident that the real battle was not over who would rule in Edward's name, but how they would shape the destiny of England. Back at Whitehall, the inventory of Henry's possessions provided a macabre glimpse into his final days. And as the bells tolled, they knew that an era had ended and a new one, fraught with its own perils, had begun. This is a history hot tip. Let's go back to the series' first episode and take a look at it from the perspective of one of Henry's doctors. This is a reimagining of history, a glimpse into the past through a fictional lens. The king's decline was a closely guarded secret, but the court was a sieve of rumors. Servants overheard physicians debating treatments in hushed tones. Courtiers exchanged glances laden with unspoken questions. Would the king recover? Could he recover? The answer lay in the macabre reality of Henry's sick room, where the once mighty monarch battled not just disease but the specter of his own mortality. He would awaken, eyes wild, claiming to see the faces of his victims at the foot of his bed. Anne Boleyn's accusing stare, Thomas More's silent judgment. "They haunt me," he whispered to Cranmer, his voice trembling with a fear he had never shown in life. His leg ulcers, now so severe that bone gleamed through necrotic tissue, required constant attention. The Duke of Norfolk, that wily fox, had sensed danger and maneuvered to protect his interests. Meetings devolved into shouting matches as Catholic and Protestant lords jostled for influence. But as his personal physician, I saw something more in those fading eyes. The dawning realization that mortality, like an unbidden guest, arrives at every door, regardless of rank or power. The mighty king, the one who had held the fate of nations in his hands, was now held hostage by the coarsest realities of existence. Fear, pain, the stench of decay, these were his companions now, and they were mine. For in tending to Henry, we also faced our own mortality, our own fears of sickness and death. It was a grim initiation, one that bound us to the king in a strange, terrible brotherhood. The fate of England hung in the balance, and so did our souls. Seymour, ambitious and calculating, positioned himself as the boy king's protector, while Norfolk's allies scrambled to salvage their power. Every decision was a gamble, every word a potential betrayal. The court was a tinderbox, and Henry's faltering pulse was the spark. Too clever by half, perhaps, for Edward Seymour, a Protestant firebrand, had used the king's illness to push his own son into the royal council, effectively placing the future king under his thumb. Norfolk's star was on the wane, and when Henry signed his death warrant for treason, played right into Seymour's hands. Yet even in death, Norfolk proved a survivor. For the very same illness that felled Henry spared the Duke's life, granting him a measure of ironic justice. Servants worked in shifts, their hands trembling as they cleaned the wounds, their noses assaulted by a stench that no amount of lavender could mask. Windows were flung open to the biting winter air whenever Henry slipped into unconsciousness, a desperate attempt to clear the miasma of decay. As January 1547 deepened, Whitehall Palace became a cauldron of whispered conspiracies. It was in this fetid atmosphere that we physicians toiled, each of us treading a perilous tightrope. Failure to save the king could mean disgrace, perhaps even a sudden trip to the Tower of London. We were summoned one by one to the king's bedside, our fates hanging in the balance. The king's physicians were a mix of old and new, traditionalists and reformers. They came from different backgrounds and had differing opinions on the best course of treatment, but they were united by their desperation. Henry, once the hunter, was now the hunted, and they were his last line of defense. We applied hot irons to his skin, hoping to draw out bad humors, force bitter concoctions down his throat. Mixtures of gold dust and crushed pearls that spoke more to Tudor desperation than medical efficacy. One of my colleagues, bolder than the rest, suggested live pigeons split open and pressed against the ulcers, a remedy that left the king howling in pain. But even as we fought to save his life, we knew that Henry might have already lost his battle. The ulcer, a grotesque parody of the heart, devoured his vitality with each passing day. The king who had ruled with such vigor was being consumed by decay. And so we turned to opium, a crutch that dulled his agony, but plunged him into a fog where reality and nightmare blurred. Outside the sick room, the court was a battleground of wills. Meanwhile, the Privy Council, that body charged with governing in Edward's minority, was fracturing under the strain. So yes, the king was dying. The final days of King Henry VIII are here. By late January 1547, Henry's body was a battlefield where disease held every advantage. On January 27th, a violent seizure racked the king, his massive frame convulsing so fiercely that attendants struggled to hold him down. He named Edward as his heir, followed by Mary and Elizabeth, a succession plan that would outlast his life. Don't forget to subscribe for more royal mishaps and historical parenting pitfalls, and I'll see you next time. Yet these moments of clarity were fleeting. More often, he rambled, his mind a labyrinth of guilt and paranoia. He spoke of Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him Edward and died in childbirth, her memory a rare source of comfort. He called for Elizabeth, his youngest daughter, only to fall silent, perhaps recalling her mother's execution. These glimpses of humanity were jarring in a man who had once wielded power with godlike certainty. The physical toll was relentless. Henry's ulcers had worsened, the infections now so deep that servants reported seeing bone through the rotting flesh. The stench was unbearable, forcing attendants to wear perfumed masks. Windows were open to the frigid February air, chilling the room but offering no relief. The king's bodily functions began to fail, requiring teams of servants to manage the grim task of cleaning his massive frame. Each movement was an ordeal, triggering screams that echoed through Whitehall's corridors. Opium provided temporary respite, but it plunged Henry deeper into delirium, his mind a battleground of memories and fears. The court's atmosphere grew increasingly surreal. Servants whispered of hearing ghostly footsteps in the night, of candles flickering without cause. Superstition, already rampant in Tudor England, took hold. Courtiers avoided the royal chambers, fearing the king's wrath even in his weakened state. Henry, aware of his isolation, grew increasingly bitter. "They abandoned me," he muttered to Cranmer, his voice a mix of anger and despair. The man who had once commanded absolute loyalty now faced death alone, surrounded by attendants who served out of fear rather than devotion. The irony was stark. The king who had reshaped England's destiny could not command his own body to obey. When the episode passed, his right side was partially paralyzed. His speech slurred, a clear sign of what modern medicine would call a massive stroke. The royal physicians, their faces etched with dread, knew the end was near. Failure to save Henry could cost them their lives, yet their tools were woefully inadequate. They resorted to ever more desperate measures, scalding irons to revive his circulation, concoctions of boiled onions and mercury that only deepened his suffering. The king, once the arbiter of life and death, was now a prisoner in his own flesh, his commands reduced to feeble gestures. The royal bedchamber became a fortress of secrecy. Archbishop Cranmer, ever vigilant, controlled access with an iron grip. Only the most trusted were allowed entry, each sworn to silence under penalty of death. Even Catherine Parr, Henry's loyal sixth wife, was barred during critical moments, her presence deemed a distraction. Cranmer's vigilance served a dual purpose, preserving Henry's dignity and preventing premature power grabs. The Privy Council, aware of the stakes, met in shadowed chambers, their debates laced with urgency. Edward Seymour moved swiftly, securing key fortresses and allies. While Norfolk's Catholic faction faltered, their leader languishing in the Tower, the court was a coiled spring, ready to snap the moment Henry drew his last breath. Henry's mental state deteriorated alongside his body. In lucid moments, he obsessed over his will, dictating revisions with a trembling quill. What do you think? What's your favorite Henry VIII movie or show? Let me know in the comments. As February dawned, the pretense that Henry might recover collapsed. On February 27th, his breathing grew labored, each gasp a struggle against the weight of his failing heart. Candles cast a sickly glow, illuminating the faces of attendants who moved like ghosts, their eyes averted from the grotesque reality before them. The official cause was recorded as natural decay, but modern analysis points to a lethal cocktail of heart failure, sepsis, and complications from type 2 diabetes. Black-draped horses pulled the massive coffin through streets lined with mourners, while effigies depicted Henry as the virile monarch of his youth, not the bloated figure he had become. Yet his sheer scale, both in life and death, ensured that he remained an indelible presence in the English imagination. He was the author of his own demise, having engineered a succession crisis by discarding wives and siring heirs in a desperate quest for a male legacy. Now, as the final curtain fell, England braced for the consequences of a king's colossal choices. At St. George's Chapel, he was laid beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a son and escaped his wrath by dying young. The ceremony was a masterclass in propaganda, reinforcing the monarchy's endurance. Even as England teetered on the edge of uncertainty, his corpse, a grotesque monument to excess, posed unique challenges. Embalmers working under pressure struggled to prepare the body, its rapid decomposition a testament to the infections that had consumed him. The lead-lined coffin, specially constructed to accommodate his girth, split under the pressure of gases, leaking fluids onto the chapel floor, final indignity for a king obsessed with majesty. The stench of decay was now inescapable, despite the incense that burned day and night. Servants worked tirelessly to maintain Henry's dignity, but the task was Sisyphean. His body, ravaged by sepsis and heart failure, was beyond saving. The physicians, their faces drawn with exhaustion, knew their efforts were futile, but continued out of duty and fear of retribution. Beyond the chamber, the court held its breath. Edward Seymour's men moved with quiet efficiency, securing loyalties and neutralizing rivals. The Privy Council, aware that Henry's death would reshape England, drafted proclamations to ensure a smooth transition. Yet the secrecy was absolute. For 3 days after Henry's death on January 28th, the Privy Council suppressed the news, allowing Seymour to consolidate power. When the bells of London finally tolled on January 31st, they marked not just a king's passing but the dawn of a new era. Edward VI, a boy of 9, was now king, with Seymour as Lord Protector ruling in his name. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned urgently, his presence a signal that the end was imminent. The king, unable to speak, lay in a twilight state, his eyes darting with a mix of fear and defiance. Cranmer, kneeling at his bedside, asked Henry to squeeze his hand if he placed his faith in Christ. With what little strength remained, Henry complied, his grip weak but resolute. It was a moment Protestant chroniclers would later seize upon, claiming it as evidence of a deathbed conversion. But in truth, Henry's faith remained as complex as his life, neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant, but uniquely his own. The royal chamber was a scene of grim theater. The massive bed, draped in black, seemed to swallow the king's bloated form. Henry's death was both a release and a reckoning. On February 16th, the funeral procession to Windsor Castle was a spectacle of Tudor power. In the tumultuous years that followed, Henry's legacy would be contested, his monuments removed, and his memory tarnished. This is our channel. And if you'd like to help us make more videos like this one, please consider supporting us through the provided means. Kings are immortal, or at least that's what the English believed of Henry VIII. After all, how could a man who reshaped England's religious and political landscape be mortal? But on January 1547, as he lay dying in Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII was anything but immortal. Paralyzed from the waist down, his skin sloughing away to reveal the bone, he was a horrific spectacle, shocking even those jaded by the Tudor court's casual cruelty. You'd think that after 6 days of agonizing, the question of how he died wouldn't matter. The skull in the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons in London has long been identified as Henry's, and yet 2 X-rays from 1912 suggest that it's not his. If that's the case, it means that the men of science examining his remains in the 1800s were wrong. Just as those same men had been wrong to attribute his death to venereal disease, how could they have made such mistakes? Because in death, as in life, Henry was more than his legend. He died believing himself betrayed, raging against his physicians and his failing body. As Thomas Cromwell had once put it, the king was full of hellfire. But in his final moments, as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer urged him to trust in Christ, he was simply Henry, a title stripped away, leaving only a man facing the most universal of truths, his own mortality. His death was gruesome, profound, and inescapable, a reminder that even the mightiest lion must fall, and that in death, as in life, all the world's a stage. But to the English court, it did matter a great deal. His illness and death fascinated physicians for centuries. A locked chest held a miniature of Jane Seymour, perhaps the only love of his life. A lock of his mother's hair, and a child's prayer book, possibly Elizabeth's. These relics were both mundane and poignant, suggesting a king who, despite his tyranny, his religious extremism, and his casual cruelty, was capable of love, grief, and even tenderness. And as Victorian scholars steeped in moralism took up the cudgels, they decided that syphilis had gotten the better of the notorious womanizer. For now, though, Edward was king, Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th wife, was Queen Dowager, and she was already on her 2nd husband. Within weeks of the funeral, she'd married Thomas Seymour, brother of the Lord Protector. Her swift remarriage underlined the precarious nature of her position and the complicated loyalties of the Tudor court. To them, Henry's agonizing death was divine retribution, proof that God punished those who strayed from the path of righteousness. Edward's Protestant regency pushed England closer to continental-style reform. But Mary's Catholic restoration and Elizabeth's middle way reflected the ambiguities of their father's later years and set the stage for a century of religious and political upheaval. Modern historians aren't so sure. Type 2 diabetes and osteomyelitis, inflammation of the bone marrow, seem a much more likely culprit. And given Henry's many jousting injuries, there's some evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Whatever the cause, his condition worsened rapidly. And as he slipped in and out of consciousness, he became a medical battleground. Doctors bled him, administered live pigeons, one of the standard remedies of the day, and concocted gold-infused potions. None of it worked. And when he died, his medical records served double duty as a macabre trophy and a proof of the physician's diligence. They recorded every treatment, every fever spike, every morsel of food consumed, charting the slow disintegration of a king. Yet this grim tableau was also a powerful symbol. It marked the end of an era, the passing of a warrior king who'd embodied England's rise to greatness, or so the propaganda told it. In reality, the story was much grimmer. In death, as in life, Henry was a puppet of those around him. And as his temperature spiked and his limbs blackened, it was clear that even a king's legacy could be hijacked. This meticulous blueprint for England's future named his children Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth as his successors, setting in motion a chain of events that would see the Tudor dynasty triumph and founder on the very real shoals of human ambition. For while Henry might have been invincible on the propaganda, posters Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset, quickly outmaneuvered the Regency Council that Henry had established. Within days, he'd seized control as Lord Protector, undoing his royal patient as careful balance of power and establishing the first of a shaky line of Regency councils. The king was dead. Long live the king. But in Tudor England, the king is dead. Long live the new Lord Protector. That was the reality. Henry's death did indeed mark the end of an era, but the myth of his invincibility lived on. Thanks in part to the court painters who'd spent his long reign crafting his image. Broad-shouldered, defiant, muscular, they ensured that this image of virile masculinity endured, even as the reality was far more like a corpse. Yet to understand what really happened to Henry, we have to start with his will. And as for Henry's legacy, well, that would take decades to play out. But the immediate aftermath was starker. What happened to his body? But these records only tell part of the story. The 19th century, academics got their hands on Henry's bones, or at least they thought they did. His personal effects, discovered after the funeral, offered a glimpse of the man behind the myth. But those qualities didn't protect his daughters. Mary and Elizabeth faced uncertain futures, and the path to the throne for both would be fraught with danger. The religious ambiguity of Henry's reign, Catholic in ceremony, Protestant in authority, would fuel decades of conflict. Henry VIII died on January 1547, the victim of terrible disease and terrible treatment, a failure of both medicine and Tudor hubris. Thanks for watching.